Well, good morning. It does seem that we've ironed out our issues with our technology this morning. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual Veterans Appreciation Program. My name is Ashley Zaverzhaleski, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Alumni Relations at Seton Hill University. It is my honor to welcome you to this morning's virtual Veterans Appreciation Program, sponsored by the Seton Hill University Alumni Association Veterans Affinity. The Veterans Affinity was founded in November 2019 by retired Colonel Bridget Widdowson and retired Master Sergeant Matt Zamoski, both graduates of Seton Hill. It is designed for alumni to gather in the name of Seton Hill around the shared interest of supporting fellow veterans and active duty military personnel through service projects, recognition opportunities, educational and career resources, and social activities. Today's virtual program honors the members of our Seton Hill community, including alumni, students, faculty, and staff, who are veterans or are currently serving in the United States military, as well as their families. Seton Hill has a long history of educating veterans and their families. In the 1940s, as a women's college, Seton Hill admitted more than 40 male World War II students to study under the GI Bill. As a yellow ribbon school, Seton Hill provides extended financial aid to veterans and their dependents, and the university has consistently been named a best college for veterans by US News and World Report. I would like to take a moment now to recognize all veterans present with us today and those who are unable to join us. Thank you for your service and dedication to our country. I now invite you to please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. The national anthem will follow. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Callie Arita. I am a Seton Hill graduate from the class of 2018, and I have the pleasure of serving alongside Ashley in the Office of Alumni Relations as the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations. Before we get our program started this morning, I want to ask that you all join me in a prayer. Dear Lord, today we honor our veterans, worthy men and women who gave their best when they were called upon to serve and protect their country. We pray that you will bless them for their unselfish service in the continual struggle to preserve our freedoms, our safety, and our country's heritage for all of us. Bless them abundantly for the hardships they faced, for the sacrifices they made for their many different contributions to America's victories over tyranny and oppression. We respect them, we thank them, we honor them, we are proud of them. We pray that you will watch over these special people and bless them with peace and happiness. Amen. It is now my pleasure to introduce the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton for our featured event, a virtual tour of the Civil War Sisters exhibit. The National Shrine is a U.S. religious site and educational center in Emmitsburg, Maryland, that pays tribute to the life and mission of Elizabeth Ann Seton, the first native-born citizen of the United States to be canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. Her spiritual sisters and daughters of charity ministered as nurses during the Civil War. During today's virtual tour, you will learn about the military encampment on St. Joseph's property and how the sisters continued the mission of Mother Seton by helping those in need. This virtual tour provides the opportunity to hear inspiring stories accompanied by artifacts and photographs. Please join me in welcoming the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley and Callie. Welcome to beautiful Emmitsburg, Maryland, and to the Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. So just let me establish, can folks see and hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. So very briefly, it was here in Emmitsburg where St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's mission began. Here she founded her sisterhood, the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, and her school, St. Joseph's School, which would grow into St. Joseph's Academy. And of course, it was here that the more widespread mission of the Sisters and Daughters of Charity in the United States that we know today began. And her spiritual her spiritual legacy, I should say, stretches all across the continent of North America to places like New York City, Seton Hill, Nazareth, Kentucky, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. In any event, where I'm standing is what we call the Civil War Sisters exhibit. It was dedicated in 2013 in honor of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Campaign. And it's dedicated to the work that not only the community here in Emmitsburg did, but the other branches of the Vincentian and Setonian families of women religious throughout the United States, serving the men in uniform during the Civil War. I'd like to introduce Bridget, who is my colleague who's standing behind the camera. So every now and then you may hear me talk to her as we go along. So now simply, thank you so much for joining us. If any questions occur to you as we make our way along, please feel free to type them in and we will do our best to get to them. And now I'd like to ask you to join me in the exhibit room. So Mother Seton herself died in 1821. In the years that followed, her community continued to grow exponentially. So her order got larger. Women were sent away from Emmitsburg on mission to other cities like Philadelphia, New York, and other sisterhoods that were founded on the model that Mother Seton had established. In 1850, her community merged with the already existing French order, the Daughters of Charity. And we remain a Daughters of Charity community to this day. At that time, the habit that the women wore at the time changed to the French habit, which included the very iconic starched white headdress known as the cornet. More to the point, the Daughters of Charity was a nursing order. Healthcare was part of their mission, and the sisters were trained in nursing as part of their preparation to take orders. So when the Civil War broke out in 1861, there were hundreds of trained nurses in Emmitsburg, but also in other religious orders throughout the country. This became crucial because very soon, hundreds of thousands, and it would become millions of men were enlisting in the military service. And neither army, the Northern Army or the Confederate Army, had anything like enough medical infrastructure for all of the men who were joining their ranks. So immediately they started reaching out to civilian sources of healthcare, and that included the orders in the Catholic Church who had nursing as part of their mission. This map shows you how widespread the activities of the Sisters and Daughters of Charity was over the course of the war. So the key shows you that the white coronet indicates the presence of Daughters of Charity, the black bonnet, Sisters of Charity, and the white bonnet, Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, a particular order in central Kentucky. So you can see just how widespread the sisters were all over the country. Most of the black caps you see would have been from Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati. And of course, it was out of those sisters in Cincinnati that the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill would be established just a few years after the war was over. So in 1861, just a month into the war, the sisters in Emmitsburg received their first pleas for help from military and government authorities. In fact, the first call for help came from the Confederates as they were establishing and expanding hospitals in Richmond and Norfolk. Knowing that there were nurses here, they wrote to the sisters asking if they would be willing to send some of their members down to Virginia to staff these hospitals. Just a month after that, in June of 1861, the first call for help came for the sake of Union soldiers. This was to staff Providence Hospital, which was being established in Washington, D.C. And if Bridget can zoom in on the photograph over here, this woman I'm indicating is the woman who was receiving all of those calls for help. Her name is Anne Simeon Norris, and she was, the official title is visitatrix. So she was the provincial superior, essentially the woman in charge of the community here in Emmitsburg. So she was the one who had to juggle all of these calls for help with the staffing that she had and the resources that were available to her. So the women would go on from their religious communities and tend the soldiers in these hospitals that were very quickly being established. As the war expanded, they would find themselves working much closer to the battlefields themselves and tending to wounded or sick soldiers either in prison camps or on naval vessels that were transporting them away from the camps and battlefields to the hospitals further behind the lines. It's important to bear in mind, the largest killer of the Civil War was not gun or cannon fire, but disease. More than 2 times the number of soldiers that died of battle wounds died of illness, things like dysentery, typhoid, diphtheria, even measles. So most of the soldiers that the sisters were tending were sick, not wounded, although many were wounded, and in fact, many were both. The gentleman who's photographed here was the religious director of the order in the Civil War era. He's an Italian-born Vincentian priest. His name is Francesco Burlando. And by September of 1861, Father Burlando knew that so many of his sisters were being sent off to military hospitals. He felt it was necessary to give them sort of a list of guidelines. And it includes a very important quote I would like to share. "The work you are engaged in is God's own work. The poor sufferers you are endeavoring to relieve are God's own children. It is my duty to remind you of the maxim of St. Vincent, which was to refrain from uttering political sentiments." which is just a way of saying the sisters were not taking sides during the war. Not only did they give their services equally to soldiers in either army, but to soldiers of all faiths, and indeed of no faith. So in 1862, a very large military hospital facility was established in Frederick, Maryland, which is only about 20 miles from here. So a group of 10 sisters went down to Frederick. They were shocked by the unsanitary conditions that they found the soldiers living in, and also by the anti-Catholic prejudice that they experienced from not only many of the other nurses working in the hospitals, but from the soldiers themselves. However, as soon as the doctors saw how much better the soldiers were getting when they were under the sisters' care, the sisters were given additional responsibilities to perform, which they were only too happy to do. I should point out that one of the sisters sent on that journey to Frederick was Sister Matilda Coskery, who was essentially the nursing authority here in Emmitsburg. She was the one who had handwritten the textbook that was used to train sisters in the arts of nursing. Not long into the war, the sisters were sent to Philadelphia. In fact, the largest Union hospital of the entire war was in Philadelphia. I think Bridget has a photograph that she can share with you. It was called Satterley Hospital. And the photograph gives you an impression of just what the scale was upon which these women were working. In fact, over the course of the war, from just this one community in Emmitsburg to just that one hospital, almost 100 women were sent to act as nurses. Now, the exhibit that's behind me depicts a sister of charity tending a wounded soldier in one such hospital. So as you can see, it's all very neat and clean, furniture, medicine bottles. As the war continued, however, sisters found themselves being transported away from these much more formal establishments and working in camps across the countryside and even on the battlefields themselves in the aftermath of fighting. So the mannequin exhibit that's behind me depicts that sort of activity, which became all the more common as the war went on. One of the real heroes of the sisters' work during the Civil War was Sister Anthony from the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, who went down to Shiloh, the battlefield that sort of stretched across northern Mississippi and southern Tennessee, and was the first major battle of the war. So as soon as there was bloodshed, the sisters were there. And here is a picture of Sister Anthony O'Connell. And as I mentioned, it was from her community, the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, that the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill would grow. So everything I've shared with you up until this point has been about the sisters going to where the soldiers were. In May and June of 1863, the soldiers came to where the sisters were. Specifically, Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River, invaded Northern Territory in what today is called the Gettysburg Campaign. And where we are in Emmitsburg, Maryland, is only about 10 miles away from Gettysburg. So the sisters here were very much involved with that campaign. So as I mentioned, the Confederate Army moved north out of Virginia into Maryland on their way to Pennsylvania. The Union Army of the Potomac came up after them. What that meant was there were about 170,000 armed men roaming through this part of the countryside. Neither army really knew where the other one was. So it was just going to be a matter of time before elements of these armies would collide and start fighting. Now, St. Joseph's Academy was closed. All the students had been sent home. There was just a handful of young girls who were still here because they happened to be from Catholic families in the Deep South, and they couldn't possibly get home because the war prevented them. There was also just a small fraction of the number of sisters who would be here ordinarily because the vast majority had been sent out to work in the military hospitals. So essentially, St. Joseph's Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland was running on a skeleton crew. Now we have pictures of what the Academy campus looked like. Are they seeing that, Bridget? The first military men to arrive in Emmitsburg got here in June 27th, specifically, of 1863. So you saw briefly what the campus itself looked like, and this shows you just how much open space there was around St. Joseph's Academy. That meant there was a lot of space for soldiers to pitch their tents. So the first soldiers arrive here on the night of June 27th. They are cavalry soldiers. They stay one night and then they saddle their horses and ride on. And typical for 19th century warfare, the cavalry will be the first military men to enter new territory, and a day or two behind them will be the foot soldiers. So the first infantry arrive in Emmitsburg on the 29th of June, 1863. If you are already familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg story, then these are names and numbers that will mean things to you. But the first infantry to arrive were soldiers of the 1st United States Army Corps under the command of John Reynolds. And then a day behind them, the 11th and 3rd Corps under the commands of Oliver Howard and Daniel Sickles, respectively. Each corps represented about 10,000 soldiers. So that means roughly 30,000 Union soldiers made their way to the Battle of Gettysburg through Emmitsburg and its immediate area. And as best as we can figure, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 of those soldiers pitched tents and stayed at least one night at the campus of St. Joseph's College. One of those soldiers was a young man from Ohio, a young lieutenant named William Ballantyne. He wrote a letter home from Emmitsburg, and it includes these details. This institution of the Sisters of Charity, farm and buildings, is the finest I ever saw. Before the war began, there were 500 Sisters of Charity in this institution. All but about 60 are with the Army in various hospitals, taking care of the sick and wounded. With respect to the 50 or 60 here, I saw but few of them. They wear black dresses without hoops, white aprons, and a white bonnet in the shape of a scoop shovel, only more so. The bonnet is the ugliest piece of furniture I ever saw, although it was white as snow. The girls are most all young and good looking, and some of them are beautiful. So the formerly peaceful environment of St. Joseph's Academy was now a beehive of military activity. Not just all of the soldiers, but everything that comes with camp life. So tents, horses, mules, wagons, guns. And the sisters have dedicated their lives to the corporal works of charity, including things like feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless. So they are offering what they can from their own supplies, which means things like bread, meat, milk for the soldiers. In fact, there is a much beloved story from the community here about Sister Mary Ann Stokes, who was in charge of the farm operations. She saw so many soldiers throughout Emmitsburg eating bread that she knew by the end of the day, nothing was going to be left for the sisters to eat tomorrow. However, when she went to the bakehouse on the St. Joseph's property, this portion of loaves that had been set aside for the sisters earlier in the day was still untouched, which seemed to indicate that somehow thousands of men had been fed out of what would ordinarily be one regular day's baking. So of course, she was instantly reminded of the miracle of the feeding of the multitude. And what she said was, "I did not see it multiplied, but I saw it there." So all of this is taking place on the 30th of June, 1863. The next day is, of course, the 1st of July, which happens to be the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. By early in the day, most of the soldiers here already had orders to keep marching north. By midday, the sounds of gun and cannon fire from the north indicated that the battle had begun. The last remaining soldiers in Emmitsburg were sent up to, were rushed to Gettysburg to participate. And now Emmitsburg's empty. But for the next 3 days, the air is alive with the sound of battle. As I mentioned, we're about 10 miles away, but that's still close enough for the windows and walls of people's houses and the actual ground under their feet to be shaking from the concussion of the cannon fire. The display cases over to my left are all filled with items that were found in and around Gettysburg in the aftermath of the battle. So we're just going to give you a chance to see some of these things. So those large shards of metal in the upper right-hand corner are fragments of exploding cannon fire. So those are the sort of things that would have been flying through the air out of cannons and doing immense damage to the soldiers in front of them. I'm going to ask Bridget to come over to the center case here. So on the side of the case, you can see bullets that, although they're old, they are in pristine, unfired condition. If you look in the middle of the case, what you see, those strange smashed shapes are the same kinds of bullets after they've hit something. The bullets are made out of lead, and lead is a soft metal, which means that when it comes in contact with something solid, its shape is going to change. So the bullets leave the rifles moving about 1,000 miles an hour and spinning about 1,000 times per second. When they come in contact with a human body, as I mentioned, they're going to spread out in their shape, but they're also still spinning. What that means is a bullet can make a hole in a person about the size of a dime and then tear a path of destruction more than 2 inches wide through that person. The wounds that were affected by these weapons were absolutely horrifying and grisly, and these were the kinds of wounds that the sisters were coming in contact with. So the Battle of Gettysburg rages July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. On the following day, the 4th of July, there is still sound of gun and cannon fire, but it's much quieter and more sporadic. And then on the 5th of July, which happens to be Sunday, 2 desperate-looking Confederate soldiers come through the St. Joseph's campus with news that the battle is over and the Confederate army is retreating. Father Burlando then loads 1 wagon with food, clothing, and medical supplies, another wagon with about a dozen women to act as nurses, and here is what the St. Joseph's wagons looked like, and they start making their way north to Gettysburg. It has been raining heavily, so the roads are muddy and they're very difficult to travel. The road that connects Gettysburg and Emmitsburg is situated halfway across the fields where Pickett's charge had been launched 2 days before. What that means is the sisters are traveling over the scenes of the most recent and most terrible fighting in order to get to the middle of town, which is where they know the hospitals are being set up. One of the sisters who made that trip, Sister Camilla O'Keefe, later set down her experience. Quote, "As we passed, the pickets lifted their caps and bowed, showing their pleasure on seeing the sisters going up to attend the sufferers. But on reaching the battlegrounds, awful. To see men lying dead on the road, some by the side of horses, it was beyond description. Hundreds of both armies lying dead almost on the track, so the driver had to be careful not to pass over the bodies. This picture of human beings slaughtered down by their fellow man in a cruel civil war was perfectly awful." The sisters arrive in the middle of town. They go to McClellan's Tavern, which is right there on the square. And then they start unloading the wagons. The sisters get out and they are sent out in groups of 2 to the various buildings in Gettysburg that are acting as the major hospitals. Now, Gettysburg is a small town. It doesn't have a hospital. So public buildings, things like churches and schoolhouses and the courthouse, those are what become the major hospitals after the Battle of Gettysburg. Father Burlando then brought the empty wagons back for another load. So well established was the reputation of the Daughters of Charity that when 2 sisters arrived to start their service at St. Francis Catholic Church the next day, this is what they experienced. This is another quote. "As soon as the surgeon in charge saw us, he took us to the ladies and to the men nurses and said to them, 'Ladies, and you men nurses also, here are the Sisters of Charity come to save our men. They will give all the instructions here. You are only desired to obey.' They bowed their assent. All this section of the country were bigoted against our holy religion, but bitterness had now lost its edge." So the sisters get to work. It's important to bear in mind the wounds that they are treating are 2, 3, even 4 days old. Some of these wounds are beginning to reek with infection. Where the soldiers have been lying down in the field, their wounds are crawling with maggots. Many of the men are realizing that they're not going to live unless they sacrifice an arm or a leg. And many others are realizing they are not going to survive. They have received mortal wounds and they're going to die soon. And so the sisters are not only tending the physical wounds of the battlefield, but the spiritual agonies of the men who realize they're about to die. Not surprisingly, many of these men being tended to by these calm women in religious habits start asking questions about the Catholic faith. And the sisters are authorized to perform baptism on any soldier that requests it. Not surprisingly then, some of their most moving accounts of their battlefield service at Gettysburg relate to the experiences they had baptizing these wounded men. Now, as we've discussed, there was strong anti-Catholic prejudice in many communities in the North. It was specifically seeing the sisters tending to the wounded and sick soldiers of the Civil War that caused many people to modify those opinions. As Mr. McClellan, the man I mentioned, the owner of the tavern, pointed out to the sisters, many people who came to Gettysburg and saw what the sisters were doing said things like, "Can those women be the people whose religion we always run down?" And then upon learning that the answer to that question was essentially yes, then vowed that they would never allow such things to be said about people who were doing that kind of work. In fact, a Protestant general said to one of the sisters, quote, "The Sisters of Charity have done more for religion during this war than has ever been done in the country before." Now I'd like to walk you over to another part of the exhibit. There is another beloved story from the religious community here in Emmitsburg. As the soldiers were headed this way, and the sisters were very anxious and fearful, they said prayers to Saint Mary that if their community survived the war, afterwards they would erect a statue of Our Lady of Victory as a gesture of thanks for answered prayers. And this is indeed that statue. So this statue had a place of honor. It seems to have always been kept out of doors for at least 100 years, but it's made out of terracotta, and the weather was not kind to it. So about 9 or 10 years ago, we had the statue moved indoors and professionally restored, and now it is a featured part of our Civil War Sisters exhibit. Now the war ends, time passes, memories begin to fade, but the service and the sacrifice of the Sisters and Daughters of Charity was not forgotten by the men who had experienced it. In 1898, a man named George Barton wrote a book called Angels of the Battlefield to make the story of the sister nurses known to a wider public. And in 1918, the United States Congress approved the placement of a monument in Washington, D.C. to honor the sister nurses of the war. Now, granted, they did not pay for it, but their permission was needed to establish it. So in terms of getting the monument designed, paid for, and placed, that was largely an activity of the Women's Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. But the monument was unveiled in 1924 after years of effort. Bridget, do they have a chance to see it? And one of its key features is a bronze relief that depicts 12 different women, each one representing one of the orders that sent women to act as nurses during the war. The Daughter of Charity is clearly identifiable because of her very distinctive headdress. And an inscription above the relief states, "They comforted the dying, nursed the wounded, carried hope to the imprisoned, gave in his name a drink of water to the thirsty." I'm going to conclude with one brief anecdote. In 1930, a sister named Mary Veronica Klimkovitz died in Baltimore. She was 91 years old, and 67 years before that, she had tended the wounded soldiers of Gettysburg. Out of respect for her wartime service, at her burial in Baltimore, she was afforded full military honors, including a playing of taps and a rifle volley. And Sister Veronica is just one of hundreds of women whose stories make up the broad account of the women religious who tended the sick and wounded during the Civil War. Guided by the charism of St. Vincent, they served God by serving their fellow human beings in a time of extreme need. And their legacy lives on in the work that the Daughters and Sisters of Charity continue to do in healthcare and assisting those whose lives have been uprooted by conflict all around the world. And in some small way, we'd like to think that their legacy lives on in the interest you have shown in their stories by joining us today. So with that, all I have to say is thank you so much for joining us. And I'm curious to know if there are any questions.
Well, thank you, Rich, and the Seton Shrine. At this particular moment, there have been no questions that have come through in the chat. But other than that, you are receiving great feedback as far as thank you and how individuals cannot wait to visit in person. Individuals being moved to tears by the work and wonderful accomplishments of the Sisters of Charity and Daughters of Charity. So thank you so much for your time with us today and sharing this virtual exhibit with us here in Pennsylvania.
Oh, great. Well,
I'll give it just a couple more seconds to see if any questions come through, and definitely turn it back over to you, Rich.
absolutely. Well, again, all we can say is thank you, but obviously we're here. We're open, and we're just 15 minutes from Gettysburg. So if anybody comes to visit, we'll be here. We're open 7 days a week. And we have, of course, not just the Civil War Sisters exhibit, but the National Shrine to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, the Basilica upstairs where her earthly remains are entombed. And also on our property, there are 2 historic buildings where the saint lived and worked. So we are always happy to receive visitors, and we're delighted to hear that they have a connection to Mother Seton's spiritual family, like the alumni of Seton Hill would.
Well, thank you, Rich. And as you were talking, we did receive 2 questions.
Okay.
The first being, where is Sister Veronica buried in Baltimore?
Great question. You know what? The funny thing was, I've been doing this tour for years. Oh, before I was able to actually get a line on that. She is buried at New Cathedral Cemetery in Baltimore.
And then the second question that came through was, did Tom's Creek have an importance?
Militarily, not really. No, that's a great question. Obviously, it was here in Emmitsburg. I don't think it's ever been specifically mentioned in the accounts, but it is almost certain that thousands of men and thousands of horses went to Tom's Creek to get a drink while they were here. I should point out that there was also not far from one of the historic houses on our property is the historic cistern, where we know for a fact that soldiers were going to fill their canteens. But apart from that, Tom's Creek doesn't play a major role one way or the other.
Thank you. And then a question about where the memorial, I believe it's in reference to the monument that Congress approved, where specifically in Washington is that located?
Yes, that is in the northwest quadrant of Washington. It's basically kitty corner to the Cathedral of St. Matthew. So if you go to the Catholic Cathedral, if you look across the street, you'll see the monument.
Great. And I see that someone else has also shared the books that you mentioned in the chat. So if there are no further questions, I would like to extend our gratitude to Rich, Bridget, and the staff at the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton for sharing your time with us this morning. We're very happy and glad to have been able to spend some time with you on the virtual tour of the Civil War Sisters exhibit. So if you could see us all, we are giving you a round of applause, and thank you again so much for your time this afternoon.
Well, it's been our pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. On behalf of the Seton Hill Alumni Association Veterans Affinity, thank you for attending today's virtual event. We plan to continue to develop programming to serve our Seton Hill community of veterans and active duty military personnel. So should you have any interest in joining this group, please reach out to the Office of Alumni Relations. This concludes our program today, so thank you for attending. However, as we sign off, we will close with the Armed Forces Medley.